How many cases did you actually resolve, Congresswoman? The question, sharp and unyielding, hung in the dense, oxygen-starved air of Room 219 inside the Hart Senate Office building like a held breath. 3 agonizing seconds ticked by. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez sat frozen behind the heavy wooden witness table, her hands pressed completely flat against the polished oak surface. Her mouth parted as if to speak, but absolutely nothing came out. The silence stretching across the hearing room was so absolute, so suffocatingly complete, that the gallery could clearly hear the sharp, mechanical click of a solitary camera shutter echoing from the tightly packed press row. It was a moment of sheer political paralysis, a stark contrast to the reality that existed just 14 hours earlier, when the hearing hadn't even begun and Ocasio-Cortez still firmly believed she was walking into a calculated fight she could effortlessly win. The meticulously orchestrated dismantling had commenced precisely at 9:14 inches the morning, with Senator Marco Rubio already speaking, completely bypassing the customary pleasantries. There was no grand opening statement, no tedious procedural preamble. He was already mid-question before the C-SPAN control room had even finished adjusting their camera feeds. Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, before we begin the formal portion of today's testimony, I want to note for the record that a family in your district, the Dominguez family from Jackson Heights, they filed a formal complaint with this committee about the consequences of current sanctuary jurisdiction policies, Rubio stated, setting an immediate, localized trap. I'll come back to them, but first I'd like you to confirm for the record your publicly stated position that detention funding should be reduced and redirected to community-based alternatives. Is that an accurate summary of your positions? The gallery behind the witness table was packed shoulder to shoulder, strictly standing room only, stretching along the back marble wall, with 3 major cable networks carrying the high-stakes feed live to the nation. Everyone who had fought for a seat in Room 219 that crisp morning came because they were absolutely certain they already knew exactly what they were about to see, or at least, they thought they did. Ocasio-Cortez leaned aggressively forward in her leather chair, both hands confidently wrapped around the slender microphone stem, projecting absolute authority. She was dressed for combat in a crisp white blazer worn over a dark, severe blouse, and her facial expression carried the highly focused, kinetic energy of a seasoned politician who had just spent the entire previous week doing back-to-back media hits, deliberately framing this very hearing as nothing more than partisan political theater. She was thoroughly prepared, she radiated confidence, and she possessed zero interest in offering passive, one-word answers to the veteran senator. Senator, that is an accurate summary, and I appreciate the opportunity to expand on it, she fired back, her cadence practiced and smooth. The current detention framework costs American taxpayers over $3 billion annually to maintain a system that separates families, criminalizes poverty, and produces outcomes that every independent study has shown are less effective than community-based alternatives. We are spending more to be crueler, she continued, cementing her narrative. That is not a policy position I arrived at casually. It is the conclusion of years of work with immigrant communities, advocacy organizations, and the families in my district who live with the consequences of enforcement-first policy every single day. The gallery immediately responded to her rhythmic rhetoric with visible nods rippling from the left side of the aisle and a low murmur of partisan approval that the stern-faced sergeant-at-arms had to swiftly silence with a cutting look. Seizing the momentum, she then added a challenge Rubio hadn't explicitly asked for. And Senator, I hope this hearing will examine all of our records equally. She offered a smile that was entirely strategic, entirely devoid of warmth. I think the committee would benefit from a complete picture. Rubio's eyes locked onto hers, silently registering the aggressive line. His pen stopped moving for exactly half a second, hovering over his yellow legal notepad, before he quickly wrote something down and seamlessly moved forward. Thank you for that clarity, Congresswoman, he replied, his voice dangerously even. I want to make sure I understand your position precisely. So it's your testimony today that you have consistently advocated for reducing enforcement funding. Is that correct? Yes or no? Yes, and I'm proud of that record, she answered without hesitation. Senator Rubio simply nodded. Slowly, deliberately, he reached into a plain manila folder positioned at his right hand and extracted a single damning sheet of paper. Then I'd like to enter into the record Document 1, a letter from your own office, dated 14 months ago, requesting an increase in ICE operational funding for your district. The atmosphere in the room violently shifted. It wasn't a theatrical gasp, but something much quieter and far more profound. The distinct collective sound of 200 seasoned political operatives instantly recalculating the entire trajectory of the morning. If this gripping political breakdown is keeping you engaged, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon right now so you never miss a new episode of Washington's rawest moments. The contradictory letter sat fully illuminated on the overhead display screens for 12 excruciating seconds before the Congresswoman formulated her response. In those dozen seconds, a frenzy erupted as every single reporter in the press row furiously began typing out the developing contradiction. Ocasio-Cortez's chief of staff, seated defensively 2 rows directly behind her, stopped a sip of coffee mid-motion and slowly set the cup down without ever taking his eyes off the back of his boss's head. Yet, the Congresswoman did not outwardly panic. She had survived incredibly tough rooms before, having masterfully answered hostile lines of questioning from aggressive committee chairs who explicitly wanted her head on a platter, only to walk out of the building possessing the viral clip of the day. She understood perfectly how to execute a political reframe. Senator, that letter addressed community safety resources in the context of a specific local concern raised by constituents, she asserted, her delivery surgically precise and deeply practiced. It was not a request for deportation funding. It was not an endorsement of the enforcement-first framework I've spent my career opposing. Context matters, and I would hope this committee understands the difference between a targeted constituent services request and a policy position. As she finished, the tense gallery visibly exhaled, relieved by her deft rhetorical parry. But Rubio refused to engage with or argue the philosophical reframe. Instead, he simply picked up the physical letter and coldly read a single, inescapable line. Page 2, paragraph 3. Your office requested funding for, and I'm quoting, directly, ICE enforcement and removal operations in connection with increased caseload in the 14th Congressional District. Is that your office's language, Congresswoman? Ocasio-Cortez's tone tightened. Senator, my office handles thousands of constituent inquiries. That language reflects a specific operational context. It does not represent my broader legislative agenda. I understand. Thank you, Rubio replied softly, setting the devastating letter back down on the desk. Now, while your office was privately requesting additional enforcement resources, I want to share something about the family I mentioned earlier, the Dominguez family from Jackson Heights. The trap was closing. That exact same month your office sent this letter, the Dominguez family contacted your constituent services line requesting urgent help with an enforcement-related case. They were told, and this is directly from the committee's record, that no additional resources were available for their situation. He let the sheer hypocrisy of the timeline land heavily in the silent room. Your office was requesting federal resources with one hand and telling a desperate family in your own district that those resources didn't exist with the other. He pressed the human cost of the contradiction. The Dominguez family has 3 children currently enrolled in public school. They have lived in Jackson Heights for 9 years. They diligently pay their taxes, they follow the law, and when they finally called their elected congresswoman for help, someone in your office told them, no. Rubio slowly raised his head, looking directly across the void at the witness table, not glancing at Ocasio-Cortez's thick briefing binder, not playing to the glowing red lights of the network cameras, but staring straight at her. 14,000 families are languishing on the housing wait list in your district right now, Congresswoman. That's not just a statistic on a spreadsheet. That is 14,000 quiet dinners where a mother and a father have to look across the table at their children and say, "We're still trying." It wasn't phrased as a question, it was a damning moral declaration, and in living rooms scattered across the vast expanse of America, ordinary people watching the broadcast on their televisions found themselves nodding in solemn agreement without even consciously knowing they were doing so. The Congresswoman's counterframe came back lightning fast, attempting to shift the blame back to Washington. Senator, the undeniable root cause of every single issue you are raising is systemic federal underfunding. When this very body refuses to adequately fund community programs, constituent services, immigration courts, and legal aid, the result is exactly the pain you're describing. The solution is massive investment, not more enforcement. The partisan gallery instantly responded to the fiery pivot. It was an undeniably strong, classic political maneuver. Rubio silently absorbed the rhetorical blow, made a brief, calculated note on his yellow pad, and explicitly chose not to rebut her argument. I appreciate that perspective, Congresswoman, he conceded smoothly. I'd now like to call our very first witness, someone who actually lives in your district and can speak directly to the federal support question you just so passionately raised. Ocasio-Cortez's tightly controlled expression instantly fractured, shifting rapidly from annoyance to genuine recognition, bypassing alarm entirely. The official hearing schedule she had meticulously reviewed with her staff listed exactly 3 expected witnesses. This particular name had absolutely not been on that list until late the previous evening. Elena Vargas walked slowly toward the center witness table with the solemn, deliberate grace of someone walking down the aisle of a church, moving with the heavy, intentional posture that only comes from a desperate desire to be taken seriously in a grand room where you inherently know you do not belong. She was 61 years old, dressed impeccably in a modest navy blue dress that she had painstakingly ironed herself that very morning, adorned only with a small, understated gold cross on a delicate chain that softly caught the bright overhead studio lights. As she sat down in the imposing leather chair, her aged hands visibly trembled. She instinctively steadied them by pressing both of her palms completely flat against the cool mahogany table before leaning toward the microphone. The raucous gallery instantly went dead quiet, not because the sergeant-at-arms instructed them to, but because there was something profoundly commanding about the raw, unpolished way this dignified woman carried her burden that simply demanded absolute silence. Rubio handled the formal introduction with deep respect. Elena Vargas, proud owner of La Cocina de Elena, a beloved Dominican restaurant situated on Southern Boulevard in the Bronx, in continuous business for 22 years. She is a legal immigrant from the Dominican Republic, a proud United States citizen for the past 15 years, a devoted mother of 3, and a grandmother of 4. He looked at her gently. Ms. Vargas, in your own words, please tell the committee what exactly prompted you to file a formal complaint with this legislative body. Vargas began to speak, choosing her words with immense care. Her accent was undeniably present, but her English was crystal clear. This was a deeply personal testimony she had intensely practiced, not in sterile conference rooms with high-priced lawyers or slick media coaches, but sitting at her own worn kitchen table at 2:00 inches the morning, with her weary daughter sitting across from her, quietly listening and gently telling her to slow down her breathing. I love my neighborhood, she began, her voice carrying the undeniable weight of decades. I raised my children there. I built my business there with my own hands. Every single morning, I unlock and open my restaurant at 5:30, and I make fresh coffee for the exact same people who have been coming to me for 20 years. Her voice grew steadier. I know all their names. I know their children. I know exactly who is sick, who just lost a job, and who desperately needs a hot plate of food but can't pay for it. That is my community. She stopped for a brief second, collected her surging emotions, and then continued, her tone darkening. But in the last 3 years, things have fundamentally changed in ways that deeply hurt the very people who were already there. My own employees' children are sitting in crowded classrooms with 42 students and only 1 teacher. My hard-working dishwasher's little daughter is in the 3rd grade, and she cannot read at a grade level simply because her exhausted teacher has 42 children and there are not enough hours in the day. She painted a devastating picture of civic collapse. The emergency room at Lincoln Hospital. My cook's wife went there complaining of severe chest pains last October, and she waited for 11 hours. 11 hours, sitting upright in a hard plastic chair, enduring chest pains. Then, the emotional core of her frustration surfaced. And my cousin Rosario, she waited 9 agonizing years to come to this great country the right way. 9 years of endless paperwork, 9 years of expensive filing fees, 9 years of doing absolutely everything they asked her to do. And now, she sits and watches people come in with absolutely nothing, no papers, no legal process, no waiting whatsoever, and immediately receive the very services that she was strictly told she had to earn. She looked up, her eyes fierce. That is not being anti-immigrant. I am an immigrant. That is simply asking why the rules of this country apply to some people and not to others. She paused, took a deep, shuddering breath, and then delivered the exact sentence that permanently altered the trajectory of the hearing. I voted for Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez twice. I truly believed her when she looked at us and said she would fight for families exactly like mine. So, when things got bad, I called her office. I called 11 times in 2 years. I have the entire call log saved right here on my phone, and I can show it to you right now. Sensing the catastrophic PR damage, Ocasio-Cortez immediately leaned forward, modulating her voice to sound intensely warm, deeply personal, and desperately reaching across the physical divide of the room. Elena, may I please call you Elena? I hear you, and your lived experience deeply matters to me. The systemic challenges you're describing are exactly why I've fought so incredibly hard for increased community investment. We share a vibrant community. We share a rich heritage. And I want you to know that your voice— Vargas snapped her head to look directly at the politician, her expression devoid of hot anger but filled with something infinitely worse. A profound, bone-deep disappointment that had been entirely worn down to a grim patience. Congresswoman, you hear me today only because there are cameras in this room, Vargas stated cleanly. I have called your office 11 times. 11. The grand room absorbed the brutal honesty of that sentence, the exact way parched, cracked soil absorbs rain after a brutal, years-long drought completely, thoroughly, and all at once. Rubio didn't miss a beat, asking the singular, surgical question required to advance the narrative. Miss Vargas, what exactly happened after your 8th call? Vargas nodded slowly, as if she had been waiting her entire life for someone in authority to ask her exactly this. On the 8th call, a young man working in the Congresswoman's office told me flatly that they could not help with my specific concern. He told me I should instead contact an organization called the Pueblo Adelante Community Alliance. He promised me they could assist me. So, I called them. The frustration bled back into her voice. They told me they did not actually handle my type of issue, but they casually offered to connect me with other services. I told them, I don't need other services. I need my elected congresswoman to answer the damn phone. She paused again, gathering her final piece of evidence. Later, my neighbor, he works downtown in the city budget office. He told me that Pueblo Adelante had recently received a massive $2.3 million federal community development grant, and that the Congresswoman's office specifically helped direct that grant to them. The narrative reframe was instantaneous and violently effective. Every single person sitting in the gallery physically felt the tectonic plates of the scandal shift. This was no longer just a sad, mundane story about a busy politician who simply failed to answer the phones. This was rapidly transforming into a devastating story about a politician whose office intentionally redirected desperate constituents to a politically connected, allied organization, all while that exact same organization simultaneously received millions in federal taxpayer funding that the Congresswoman herself had helped arrange. Senator Rubio briefly looked at Elena Vargas with solemn respect, and then he turned his gaze away from the witness table, looking directly into the red tally light of the primary broadcast camera, not at Ocasio-Cortez, not at his fellow committee members, but straight through the lens at the 23 million ordinary Americans watching in stunned silence from their living rooms. Mrs. Vargas did everything perfectly right. She came to this country legally. She built a successful business from scratch. She pays her taxes on time. She desperately called her congresswoman 11 times, and the system coldly told her she simply wasn't a priority. He paused for one agonizingly long second. If Mrs. Vargas isn't a priority in this country, then who is? That loaded question landed with explosive force in every single living room across America, striking a chord with every forgotten viewer over the age of 50 who had ever called a labyrinthine government office only to be put on endless hold, resonating with every hardworking taxpayer who had ever been condescendingly told their urgent, real-world concern was not a current priority. They vividly heard Rubio articulate the exact same furious question they had been quietly asking themselves for years. If you are watching this right now and thinking of someone who desperately needs to hear this story of bureaucratic betrayal, share this video link with them right this second. Behind the Congresswoman, her senior political aide was frantically texting on his phone, his two thumbs moving at a blistering, desperate pace. Ocasio-Cortez's jaw was rigidly set in a harsh, defensive manner that the media cameras had never previously captured. She possessed absolutely no answer for Vargas's devastatingly grounded testimony, primarily because offering any truthful answer would require publicly admitting that 11 desperate calls purposely went unanswered, and because the devastating revelation regarding the Pueblo Adelante connection had arrived from a tactical blind spot her expansive team had completely failed to prepare for. Rubio politely thanked Vargas for her time. The deep respect echoing in his voice was not performed or artificially manufactured. He smartly chose not to editorialize or step on what she had just said, allowing the agonizing truth of her words to just sit heavy in the air. Then, Ocasio-Cortez aggressively leaned back into her microphone, her voice tightly controlled but undeniably sharp. "Senator, I'd like to respond to that. And when I'm entirely done, I have some serious questions about your own record that I think this committee desperately needs to hear." She reached decisively into her own thick folder. She had come prepared for a dogfight, armed with deep opposition research, and she fully intended to unleash it to change the catastrophic narrative. "Since we're intensely examining records today, Senator, let's examine yours." She did not wait for the chairman's formal permission, dramatically producing a printed document and holding it up high so the C-SPAN cameras could clearly zoom in on the official letterhead. Correspondence between Senator Marco Rubio's office and Geo Group, one of the largest private immigration detention facility operators in the entire country. This is public record, formally filed with the Senate Ethics Committee. Her voice rose, attacking. "Geo Group's Political Action Committee donated exactly $50,000 to your political campaign, Senator. Shortly after, this letter from your office facilitated an expedited permit review for a massive facility expansion in South Florida. You want to grandstand and talk about who answers the phone? Let's talk about exactly who answers your phone. Because when Geo Group called, someone in your office magically picked up on the very first ring. The gallery immediately split, with one highly partisan side erupting in vocal support of her counterpunch. She kept swinging. "And let's look at your voting record, Senator. Community Development Block Grants, the exact same federal grants that fund vital organizations serving families exactly like Elena's. You voted no. The Emergency Housing Assistance Act, designed to help families currently sleeping in homeless shelters in your own home state. You voted no. Legal immigration pathway expansion? You actively co-sponsored the draconian bill that slashed those pathways by a staggering 40%. In this moment, Ocasio-Cortez was back in her element fast, syncopated, mathematically building the fiery, rebellious version of herself that had meticulously constructed a massive national following. The rhetorical rhythm she deployed was undeniably dangerous, and every person in the gallery could physically feel the momentum trying to shift. Rubio patiently waited until she was completely finished. He allowed exactly 2 seconds of deafening silence to pass. Not 5 dramatic seconds, not 3 hasty ones, exactly 2. He deliberately did not remove his reading glasses, he absolutely did not look down at his notes in defeat, and he intentionally did not take a sharp breath that the sensitive microphone could pick up. He simply waited the exact calm, calculating way an experienced man waits for speeding traffic to pass before calmly stepping off the curb to cross the street. "The Congresswoman is completely correct about those specific votes," he stated plainly, disarming her attack with brutal honesty. "Every single one of them. I've cast thousands of votes in this body over the years. Certainly, there are some I'd cast differently if I had the chance today. She's also factually correct that Geo Group's PAC legally donated to my campaign. That's entirely on the public record. However, that facility permit followed standard, rigorous review procedures. There was absolutely no expedited treatment." Then, he leaned slightly forward, his tone completely devoid of anger, entirely stripped of theatrical outrage, leaving only a clear, devastating focus. "But I want to point something crucial out to everyone watching. Congresswoman, you just spent 2 full minutes aggressively talking about my record, and I sat here and let you finish. Do you know exactly why I did that? Because every single second you furiously spend talking about my lengthy voting history is a second you don't have to spend answering the actual question of why Elena Vargas called your office 11 times and nobody bothered to pick up the damn phone." The entire gallery immediately plunged back into silence. It wasn't the divided, split reaction from her aggressive counterattack just moments before. It was an absolute, terrifying silence because every single politically astute person sitting in the room clearly understood what had just expertly happened. Ocasio-Cortez's furious counterattack was violently exposed not as a display of political strength, but as an act of desperate evasion, and Rubio had ruthlessly named it out loud for the cameras. He twisted the knife gently. "My parents came to this country with absolutely nothing to their names. They called their congressman's office exactly once in their lives, and someone answered. That's all this is fundamentally about, someone doing their job and answering the phone." Ocasio-Cortez desperately began to formulate a response, but Rubio had already ruthlessly moved on to his next piece of artillery. "I'd like to formally enter Document 3 into the committee record," he announced, swiftly sliding a bound report across the long table. The glossy cover page was clearly visible to the zooming cameras. It was an official program evaluation originating from Ocasio-Cortez's own district office brightly highlighting a heavily publicized community workforce initiative she had passionately championed. It was universally hailed as a massive success story. High job training numbers, impressive placement rates, touted as a model of community transformation. The Congresswoman suspiciously looked at the document and then shot a look at Rubio. Genuine confusion rapidly crossed her face before she could forcibly stop it. Why on earth would her Republican opponent willingly introduce evidence that explicitly made her look highly competent and successful? "This is a highly impressive program, Congresswoman," Rubio stated, seemingly full of praise. 600 people properly trained, 400 successfully placed in good-paying jobs. Your congressional office managed this complex initiative directly, is that correct? She studied the report intensely for 3 long seconds before risking an answer. She inherently did not trust the line of questioning, but the physical document was undeniably real, the impressive results were real, and the political credit was unequivocally hers. "Yes," she answered cautiously. "The Bronx Workforce Pathways Initiative was easily one of the most successful community development programs in our district's history. I'm incredibly proud of what our dedicated team accomplished." "You absolutely should be," Rubio agreed smoothly. "Tell me, how exactly was it funded?" "I see federal community development grants, city matching funds, and a key community partnership with 3 local organizations." He leaned in. "Specifically, Congresswoman, which internal budget line in your district office allocation funded the crucial community partnership component?" The trap slammed shut. A panicked, whispered exchange immediately erupted between Ocasio-Cortez and her chief aide. The visibly sweating aide frantically flipped to the dense appendix of the report, ran a trembling finger down the page of budgets, and stopped dead. The celebrated community partnership had been cleverly funded by quietly reallocating money directly from the office's core constituent services budget, the exact same vital budget that paid the salaries for the entry-level staff whose entire job was to answer the phones. The exact same staff who theoretically would have taken Elena Vargas's desperate calls. Ocasio-Cortez's greatest publicized success story had been literally built by quietly defunding the unglamorous office infrastructure that was supposed to serve invisible people like Vargas. The flashy program that successfully generated glowing headlines, viral press releases, and prime campaign talking points had been directly paid for with the exact budget line that would have paid for the human being who should have answered the phone when Elena Vargas called for the 8th time, and the 9th time, and the 10th time, and the 11th time. She had not courageously chosen between doing good and doing bad. She had cynically chosen between the politically visible and the politically invisible, between the 400 people whose success stories would perfectly populate a glossy campaign newsletter and the thousands of marginalized people whose unanswered, desperate calls would never appear anywhere at all. Rubio purposefully did not editorialize the damning revelation, he simply let the math do the bleeding. He coldly asked, "So, the 400 celebrated job placements were funded by directly reallocating vital constituent services resources. Tell me, how many of those 400 people placed through this program were also constituents who had long pending cases rotting with your office?" Trapped by the numbers, she deflected. "I would need to thoroughly review the specific data on that overlap, Senator." "Fair enough," Rubio replied dismissively. "Let's move on." The pace of the interrogation rapidly accelerated, the questions shortening into rapid-fire blows. "Congresswoman, I'd like to enter the Congressional Budget Office's fiscal analysis of the sweeping immigration policy framework you recently co-sponsored. The 10-year projected cost is staggering. You've enthusiastically cited the CBO as an authoritative source on at least 14 separate occasions in public statements. Do you accept their methodology? Yes or no?" "In general, yes," she conceded. "Thank you. Using the CBO's exact numbers, which you just validated on the record, which specific social programs in your district would you personally cut to fund this massive proposal?" Grasping for talking points, Ocasio-Cortez confidently named abstract revenue sources, sweeping tax reform, massive reallocation from defense spending, corporate minimum tax adjustments. Rubio waited patiently until she finished her litany. "Congresswoman, I specifically asked which existing programs you would cut. You've named theoretical revenue sources that frankly don't exist yet. There are 14,000 real families languishing on your district's housing wait list right now, not after some magical tax reform passes next year, but right now. They desperately need an answer that exists today." He then picked up another piece of paper and read a single, haunting line from a constituent letter, not from Vargas, but from someone the room had never heard of before, yet would now never forget. Maria Chen, a resident of Queens, a legal immigrant from Taiwan who patiently waited 7 long years for United States citizenship. She dutifully attended every single appointment. She accurately filed every single form. She flawlessly passed every test. She paid every exorbitant fee. She did absolutely everything this country asked her to do for 7 years without a single complaint. His voice hardened. And when she finally contacted your office begging for help with a bureaucratic processing delay that had unjustly added 11 months to her wait, your staff officially responded in writing. I'm reading directly from the constituent response log filed with this committee. This matter is not a current priority for the Congresswoman's office at this time. The silence returned, thicker than before. 7 words, Congresswoman, handed to a woman who gave this country 7 years of her life. This story of political accountability is still unfolding. If you want to see exactly how this explosive confrontation ends, subscribe to the channel right now. You absolutely don't want to miss what happens next. Rubio immediately entered Document 4 into the official record. Internal constituent response data from Ocasio-Cortez's own office, quietly obtained through a standard congressional transparency request. The damning spreadsheet meticulously covered 18 full months of citizen inquiries, heavily sorted by category. The data was irrefutable. Immigration. Related inquiries consistently received the absolute lowest response rate of any measured category, statistically lower than housing issues, lower than healthcare pleas, remarkably even lower than mundane noise complaints and routine parking disputes. This massive gap was not a marginal clerical error. It was deeply structural. It was a conscious political choice. Ocasio-Cortez desperately began to respond about the flawed nature of the data. Those numbers simply don't accurately reflect, she abruptly stopped. For exactly half a second, her eyes dropped involuntarily to the damning paper sitting in front of her. She forced herself to start again. Those numbers deeply require context, Senator. Her assertive voice was back, her practiced rhythm mostly recovered. But the perceptive gallery had undeniably heard it, that agonizing half a second where her confident cadence violently broke, a half second where the invincible political machine visibly stuttered. It was the very first crack in her armor. Perhaps small enough that she thought she could quickly cover it, but undeniably large enough that 23 million people watching intently at home noticed the slip. Rubio noticed it too. He expertly chose not to press the advantage in that moment, instead filing the weakness away for the final blow. When my mother had a serious problem, she called her congressman's office, and a real person answered. That's not a Republican issue or a Democratic issue, Congresswoman. That's just the basic job, Rubio stated, before calmly announcing a sudden 5-minute recess. As Ocasio-Cortez nervously reached for her glass of water, he casually added one final sentence, delivering it almost as an afterthought. When we return, I have just one question for you. Just one. The political atmosphere in the hallway outside room 219 crackled with anxiety during the recess, as Ocasio-Cortez's staff scrambled in visible panic while citizens across the country, like Diane Mercer in Ohio, began to awaken to the gravity of the unfolding testimony. When the hearing resumed, Ocasio-Cortez projected a hardened, defensive posture, but the momentum had shifted. Senator Rubio returned with surgical precision, moving from administrative negligence to a broader exposure of a systemic, selective service model. He methodically dismantled her credibility by highlighting her empty promises to a constituent promises backed only by a perfunctory email to an agency she ostensibly opposed, while simultaneously pointing to her office's role in directing $2.3 million in federal grants to Pueblo Adelante, an organization that failed to provide the very aid it was funded to deliver. As Rubio linked the plight of Elena Vargas and Maria Chen to a broader, intentional pattern of redirecting desperate constituents toward politically connected entities, the Congresswoman's rhythmic, rehearsed defense began to disintegrate. The climax arrived with Rubio's fatal question, how many cases did you actually resolve? Confronted with her own internal data, the Congresswoman's once passionate cadence fractured, leaving her unable to maintain her narrative as the stark reality of the numbers silenced the room and stunned a nationwide audience of 23 million viewers. Rubio did not gloat, but instead delivered a chilling verdict, framing the outcome not as a systemic failure, but as a system working exactly as designed, only not for the constituents it was meant to serve. The aftermath was immediate. The viral image of Elena Vargas's steady, 4-word testament, catalyzed a national reckoning, leading to a sudden retreat of the Congresswoman's political allies and the quiet withdrawal of key co-sponsors from her legislation. As Ocasio-Cortez retreated into a 8-hour social media silence and investigators began scrutinizing the Pueblo Adelante grant records, the story took a final, haunting turn back at La Cocina de Elena. With the quiet resolve of a woman who had finally been heard, Elena Vargas wiped her counter and prepared to hold power accountable once more, knowing that while the hearing had ended, the true consequences were only just beginning to surface.